For one of my last episodes on the American Civil War, it's time to go to one of the more famous Civil War sites the National Park Service looks after. If you've ever driven across the panhandle of West Virginia or looked at a map and wondered why on earth West Virginia has that long, skinny arm reaching up between Maryland and Pennsylvania, well, then you have noticed the geography that makes Harper's Ferry important. This water connection to the rest of the world was essential for West Virginia when it split off of regular Virginia in 1863. That is, mid-war, to become a free state rather than a slave state. The town of Harper's Ferry sits right at the confluence of the Shenandoah and Potomac rivers, which means it sits right at the junction of two very different worlds. To the north and east, the industrial corridor of the Union with its rail connections, ironworks, and humming manufacturing economy. And to the south and west, the agricultural hinterlands of Virginia, organized around plantations, river transport, and the export of cash crops. The park is probably best known as the site of John Brown's 1859 raid on the Federal Armory. He and his crew had a plan to arm themselves and, quote, to free every Negro in this state, unquote, meaning Virginia. This failed raid was part of the foundational mythology that made the American Civil War seem inevitable. You can still see the armory, or at least the engine house, where Brown made his last stand. And the National Park Service has done a thoughtful job of presenting the full context. The raid, the trial, the reactions north and south, and what it all meant for a country hurtling towards war. The essential point of this location for this episode is the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, one of the first railroads in the country, and it ran right through Harper's Ferry, which of course got its name from being a literal ferry across this essential river crossing. Because it connected the industrial heartland of the north to the agricultural south, control of that line and of the bridge across the Potomac was a genuine strategic obsession for both sides in the early years of the war. I mean, the town would change hands 8 times over the course of the war. If you travel there today, you can walk around Harper's Ferry, perched above those two rivers, and you can see the bones of both systems, the industrial north and the agrarian south, right there in one small town. Though the town itself currently has a permanent population of less than 300, it has played several important roles in American history outside of the Civil War. I mean, it was the armory Meriwether Lewis went to for various supplies, including an ill-fated collapsible boat. It was the site of Storer College, one of the first black colleges in the country. And its association with John Brown's raid made it an early tourism destination for black folks looking for vacation spots as they gained leisure time and the affluence to travel. The Hilltop House Hotel, built there in 1888 by an early graduate of Storer College, welcomed these tourists, as most hotels did not. And incidentally, a restoration project of Hilltop House Hotel is currently underway. Harper's Ferry was also home to an early amusement park built by the B&O Company to induce passenger traffic onto the line. So Harper's Ferry National Historical Park is a place that history rotated around and traveled through frequently, and is still a fabulous place to visit. And even more fun, you can travel there right on theme. The MARC commuter line from Washington, D.C. runs right there. Episode 169. Not having enough railroads will make you salty in the bad way. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at salt, specifically at the moment in the American Civil War when the South discovered that importing almost all your salt from foreign suppliers was a bad idea, especially if you're going to do a war. And I'll also look at how the uneven development of the railroad system in the United States grew out of very different ideas about what an economy is for. To learn about all of this, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that the American Civil War is the last time salt will hold such central importance as a preservative. From here on out, salt, while still widely used, will decline in importance as the way to keep your food from spoiling. Canning is moving in as a method for everyone, rather than as just a novelty for rich folks. The rise of the steam engine and the resultant rising understanding of how pressure, gases, and temperature are all linked brings in mechanical refrigeration. We get dehydration by machine, freezing, and eventually there will even be vacuum packing and nitrogen flooding. But that's further in the future. The American Civil War caused many things to change, but by far the most glossed over is the impact it had on food preservation technology. I mean, many cultures, most cultures, all cultures have, over the millennia, devised ways to preserve food that fit in with the tools their climate and landscape gave them. Sinking things in water, dehydration, smoking, freezing, pickling, turning things into jelly in water made basic by leaching wood ash. They all devised ways to preserve food that fit in with the tools, climate, and landscape that were provided. And they all share one fundamental dependency. Until the Civil War era, all food preservation was basically dependent on the weather, on what the local climate was doing. After the Civil War, food preservation will become more and more separated from the conditions outside, until we reach now, where we barely think about any of this at all. But before we leave that era completely behind, let's look one last time at food preservation in the middle of the 19th century in America and how it was tangled up in the uneven food shortages that were pretty much a main storyline in the American Civil War. A defining feature of the American Southeast is that it's damp, moist even. And this is probably part of the reason American school children and the adults they eventually grow into tend to think of North as uphill and South as downhill, as though the whole country is tilted, every map is tilted. And there's something to it. I mean, the major river systems in the United States do run roughly north to south, following the shape of the land. The Mississippi Basin drains most of the continent's interior southward to the Gulf of Mexico. The South has the country's largest swamp, the Okefenokee. It has the continent's largest river delta, and the low country along the Atlantic coast, where the majority of American shipping operated during the first few centuries of European settlement. They're all down there and it's like they're sinking. We think of the North as damp and chilly, the Southwest as rocky and dry, and the Southeast as steamy and persistently moist. And this is an oversimplified set of umbrella descriptions, and they work well enough to be useful. It's just that in other parts of the world, South is not downhill everywhere. I mean, look at the Nile River. But the orientation of the major watercourses in North America does lead us into this mental trap. Now, one significant consequence of all that moisture is that it's difficult to make salt, especially using evaporation, in the Southeast. And yet, salt was essential to food preservation in the two main ways European colonizers knew, and it played an important supporting role in the third method they developed with some very directed guidance from the indigenous locals on the ground in the Americas. Now, these methods, which we've covered extensively, were the pickling stuff in a brine solution, using salt to dry out hanging meat, and the American innovation was salted pork smoked over hardwoods, though other variations, including using corn cobs, popped up everywhere. In the North, salt was a bit less important for year-round preservation. They had more options for doing things like harvesting winter ice, creating or using cold caves, and building primitive refrigeration structures. But south of Virginia, this was not possible in any meaningful way. I mean, you could import ice for parties and stuff, but it just wasn't available in the same way. Realistically, if you wanted to preserve food for any length of time in the Southeast, you needed salt. You needed a lot of it, and you needed a consistent supply. At this point in history, there were really 3 ways to obtain salt. The easiest was to find a large salt deposit near ground level and just mine it directly. The second was to locate pools of water sitting atop underground salt deposits, brine seeps or surface pools, and apply heat to evaporate the water and leave the salt behind. And the third method was to harness wind, sunshine, and a series of gravity-fed shallow pools to evaporate seawater slowly until salt crystallizes out of it. This last method, solar sea salt farming, requires the right combination of reliable sun, consistent wind, low humidity, and flat coastal terrain. The largest salt mines in the United States, along with the most productive brine seep operations, were concentrated in upstate New York, Ohio, and Pennsylvania in the 19th century. The climatic and geographic conditions needed to make sea salt farming profitable over the long term simply didn't exist in enough of the country to make it an industry. Salt was theoretically available in the Southeast. Deposits would be found and worked during the war. Avery Island was discovered to be a giant block of salt then and later became the home of Tabasco. But the same cash cropping mentality that led plantation owners to import pigs from the Appalachian backcountry and beef cattle from Texas rather than raising much of their own also meant they preferred concentrating their efforts on growing a few highly profitable export crops rather than investing in developing local industries like salt production. The result was that nearly all the salt the Southeast consumed was imported from elsewhere. And while that relationship had never felt precarious, and it wasn't right up until the moment it became catastrophic. The major sources of imported salt in this era were Britain, which was mastering the use of vacuum boiling technology and whose salt deposits were conveniently close to major export locations. Then there were the ABC Islands, that is Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao, along with several other low-lying Caribbean islands that had all built significant salt industries around their flat, sun-drenched, wind-dried coastlines. To put some numbers to the dependency, salt consumption in this period ran to about 50 pounds per person per year. And that's a significant quantity to be sourcing entirely from overseas. This had a lot to do with the fact that Americans outside the major port cities also had considerably fewer options for purchasing food than their European counterparts did. The village market system, which had developed over the centuries there, had not developed here, and this made home preservation essential. Europe, being significantly colder than the American Southeast and Midwest for much of the year, had actually developed even more varied preservation traditions out of long necessity. But the American reliance on salt-heavy methods like brining and smoking meant that any interruption to the salt supply would be felt almost immediately in the kitchen, in the smokehouse, and in those winter stores. At the start of the Civil War, when most people on both sides were expecting a short conflict conducted in something closer to the formal 18th century style, with fewer blockades and a shorter list of contraband goods, and a generally gentlemanly assumption that commerce would continue as usual, salt moved freely enough. That calculation changed sharply when the Union declared salt as a contraband item in 1862, and so cut it off from the Confederate market as deliberately as munitions and medical supplies. With salt imports interrupted, a variety of increasingly desperate improvised solutions began to emerge across the South. Households boiled down their old pickling solutions to recover whatever salt remained, dissolved in the brine. They soaked inedible scraps of heavily salted meat and boiled that water down for the same purpose. And a common but deeply frustrating practice was digging up the dirt floors of old smokehouses to recover the salt that had leached into the soil over years of brining and smoking meat above it. A smokehouse floor was genuinely, measurably salty. The problem was that your average household had no effective method for separating salt from mud. The attempts were crude and the results were gritty at best. More than one journal and letter from this period mentions the particular desperation of muddy smokehouse salt, which tells you something about how bad things had gotten. A Confederate salt industry did eventually emerge, cobbled together from sea salt boiling operations along the coast and what mining could be organized from newly identified deposits, including Avery Island. But it was absolutely inadequate to meet the needs of a society that had previously relied on imported salt for nearly all of its food preservation. And even when salt was successfully produced, it faced another problem: raids by U.S. Army soldiers and naval landing parties that were specifically organized to destroy salt works wherever they found them, treating them correctly as strategic infrastructure. And even when they did successfully produce or mine salt and not have it destroyed, then it still had to be distributed across a territory that was poorly equipped to move bulk goods within it. See, transport in the South had, up to this point, been developing along very different lines than in the North. Back in the 18th century, all of colonial America had been plagued with terrible roads, and most meaningful trade and transport happened over water. As regular listeners to older episodes will remember, the Pennsylvania and Massachusetts turnpikes were expensive investments, yet the northern colonies and then states created and then maintained them anyway because good roads helped grow an interconnected regional economy where goods and people moved between towns and cities. As northern industry developed and economic ties between states deepened, road travel improved steadily, and then rail travel arrived to connect major cities and ports into something approaching a network. At the midpoint of the 19th century, there were approximately 30,000 miles of railroad track across the United States. Of those, about 21,000 miles lay in Union territory. Only about 9,000 miles were on the Confederate side of the line, but the disparity in mileage, significant as it was, tells only part of the story. The organization and intent behind those miles differed just as fundamentally as the quantity. Northern tracks were laid out in something approximating a grid, connecting cities to other cities and facilitating trade and travel between economic centers. Because multiple railroads operated in overlapping territories and their customers benefited from that interoperability, these lines gradually converged on compatible rail gauges. And after the predictable amount of squabbling over rates and territorial rights, it was generally accepted that allowing trains from one railroad to run on the tracks of another served everyone's interests. The Northern rail system was, imperfectly but meaningfully, a network. Southern railroads had been built to do something quite different. They mostly ran from some point inland within a single state out to a coastal port, with the specific purpose of moving cash crops to export markets and bringing imported goods back in. They basically connected plantations to ships, not towns to each other. Because southern lines rarely intersected in ways that required coordination, there was no commercial pressure to agree on a common rail gauge, and so no agreement was ever reached. Rolling stock from one railroad could not run on the tracks of another. The system had been designed from the beginning to serve the plantation export economy, and it reflected that purpose in every mile of its layout. Building a network that encouraged trade between southern states or that supported the development of regional industry would have undermined the very mercantilist logic that the whole arrangement was built on, so it was never done. The result was that even when Confederate salt production managed to get off the ground, moving salt from where it was made to where it was needed was a logistical puzzle with no good solutions. Gaps between incompatible lines had to be bridged by wagon and mule. Damaged sections could not be rerouted around because there were no alternative routes, and damage was becoming increasingly common for reasons we're about to get to. The deeper problem, though, was not really the railroads in isolation. It was the entire logic of how the Confederate war effort was being managed, or rather, not managed. The South could, in principle, have grown enough food to feed itself and its armies, or gotten a lot closer than it did. Many of the largest landowners, however, chose to continue growing cotton rice, indigo, and tobacco in hopes that the war would be brief and that maintaining export capacity would serve them better in the peace that was to follow. There was a striking absence of coordinated planning at the Confederate government level, a widespread failure to think seriously about where the food would actually come from and how it would move around. To be fair, if I must, to the Confederate War Department, this kind of large-scale logistical analysis was largely beyond the capacity of any government as young and improvised as the Confederacy's. But the failure was also cultural. A governing class that had always organized its world around the interest of individual large landholders, that had never really wanted to think about collective infrastructure, found itself unable to think that way in a crisis that demanded this sort of collective awareness and thinking. Setting aside the question of whether enough food could have been grown, the physical arrangement of Southern transport infrastructure simply was not built to move bulk food and other supplies from areas of surplus to areas of need. This arrangement is rooted all the way back in how the Southern colonies had been originally settled. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, Southern land grants had been issued in large blocks, with the explicit goal of establishing self-sufficient plantation operations that would grow valuable export crops and handle their own domestic needs more or less internally. Each large plantation was supposed to function as its own small economy. It had the mill, the distillery, and the dock. It brought what it could not make through the big house, and it sold it to surrounding farmers who depended on its services. This logic, remember, is mercantilist, where you accumulate silver, you minimize the outflows, and you do as much for yourself as you can. And it worked reasonably well as a model for running a large private estate. What it never developed was any mechanism for connecting the estates to each other or for building the kind of shared infrastructure that would allow the region to function as an integrated economy rather than a collection of adjacent but largely independent fiefdoms. It is worth noting that many of these plantations had been established by younger sons and financially marginal cousins of English landowning families, people who were working from a playbook inherited from the English aristocracy and had no particular reason to question it. Their persistent refusal to adapt to changing economic conditions would, over the following century, subject many of the estates to the same slow decline that was overtaking their counterparts in England as the Industrial Revolution rearranged the basis of wealth. Lords of the manor on both sides of the Atlantic found that a world organized around extracting value from an inherited land and cheap labor was being outpaced by one organized around making things and moving them efficiently. Meanwhile, in the northern colonies, settlement had typically been undertaken by smaller landowners looking to farm productively or to build businesses that participated in and depended on the broader regional economy. Things like metal foundries, glassmakers, cloth weavers, wagon wrights, printers, and eventually machinists, engineers, and industrial chemists all required customers and suppliers outside of their own gates. A miller in the north was primarily a miller serving a community of independent farmers, not the owner of the mill that happened to also run several other businesses as a captive service to his own workers and local tenants. This difference in economic structure meant that technology developed more rapidly in the north and was deployed more widely because the people inventing the technology were the ones who stood to benefit from it. There's a direct line from this difference in economic structure to the military situation of the Civil War. In the South, enslaved people provided the labor that produced nearly all the export goods, which meant there was neither the incentive nor the workforce available to develop labor-saving technology. In the North, where the economics of wage labor created a constant pressure to reduce the cost of production, mechanical innovation was aggressively pursued. Mechanical combines and multi-row plows transformed northern agriculture. Rolling mills for working iron and steel were built and operated across the industrial North. The military consequence of this last point is worth dwelling on because the South had almost no iron rolling mills of its own. The rolled iron plate that the U.S. Navy was able to use as armor on its gunboats was simply unavailable to the Confederate side. And to the point in this episode, the rails for Southern railroads had to either be produced in basically a single rolling mill operating in the South, or imported from Britain or purchased from Northern foundries before the war began. Once the war started, new rails became nearly impossible to obtain, which meant that damage to the Confederate rail network was not merely inconvenient, it was basically permanent. A destroyed bridge could eventually be rebuilt, but a rail line that had been deliberately sabotaged was gone for the duration. You couldn't fix what you couldn't make. And this was what General Sherman understood when he began his march through Georgia and the Carolinas. His soldiers were instructed to build fires of railroad ties and heat the rails until they glowed. And then they would bend them around trees or large rocks into shapes that could not be straightened by field crews or transported to a mill for re-rolling. The resulting twisted loops of metal were bent in ways that stretched out one side and compressed the other, which permanently altered the grain of the steel. These loops became known as Sherman's neckties, and every mile that one of these neckties cut off from train travel was a mile that Confederate supplies, including whatever salt had been laboriously produced and collected, had to be hauled on foot. And this sort of labor by horse, mule, or human was so slow, it essentially brought that sort of necessary transport to a stop. The result of all this, it's pretty bleak. Not enough track had been laid out to begin with. And the pattern that connected plantations to ports rather than communities to each other, and the fact that the rails were often built on incompatible standards that prevented any sort of improvised rerouting, made a system that was too fragile to survive this sort of targeted destruction. The lack of any local capacity to repair or replace damaged material pretty much doomed it. The Confederate rail system could be, and was, broken precisely because it had never been designed to be anything other than a delivery mechanism for export commodities. When it was asked to function as the logistical backbone of a nation at war, it could not meet the challenge. And what all of this meant practically was that food shortages in the Confederacy were spotty but severe when they hit. A community might be sitting near a depot full of salt, cornmeal, and other supplies, while another town, 50 miles away, went without, because there was no reliable way to move tons of bulk goods laterally across the territory. When U.S. Army columns arrived, they had something the Confederate supply system largely lacked: horses, mules, and the organizational capacity to commandeer and move food across the countryside. Union forces were able to draw on their own supply lines and whatever they could collect from the farms, plantations, and homesteads they were passing through. These actions, of course, did not exactly endear them to the local population, and the practice had a distinctly old-style flavor. They had gone back to armies feeding themselves off the land, the way armies had done for centuries before somebody had decided that systematically supplying your troops was both more humane and more militarily effective. The grudges, the locust-like behavior of a traveling army develops do not disappear quickly. And so now you know about the salt shortages and why food shortages were spotty and strange across the South. Next week, I'll take a look into the last topic I'm going to cover for this war, partly because, war, I'm tired of it. And the major changes that affected food, canned food and transport by train, we've covered. But mostly because the next period of American food history is fun and exciting and full of innovations. But before we can get there, we have to pause and look at this one last thing. The time America embarked on creating an enormous carceral system for its own citizens. Sure, the U.S. had been working on perfecting mass incarceration for enslaved workers, but the end of the Civil War is the first time the United States had to reckon with the care and feeding of a large number of prisoners by the government. What that looked like, how they fed people, and a few lessons they learned are all part of the next and last episode, Around the American Civil War. Thanks for listening. Any questions or quibbles will, of course, reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com, and comments and reviews about these episodes on your favorite pod listener device of choice are always appreciated, as are those recommendations. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads and Insta as @THOAFood, and as always, the link to the show notes is in the show description.